Right. So this section is going to be focused on the endocrine system a little bit, but also feedback loops within the endocrine system and homeostasis. So in this section, we're going to talk about how your body regulates the different cell communication processes we've been learning about in this unit. This is found in chapter 32.2, but we also took a little bit from other classes like anatomy to kind of make this make a little more sense for you. But if you're following along in the textbook, 32.2 is a good place to start. In this section, we're going to start by talking about the levels of organization. So we've talked about atoms and how atoms make up molecules. Those make up macromolecules like carbs, proteins, lipids, and nucleic acids, which make up organelles, which make up cells, which make up tissues, which make up organs. And then finally, our organ systems make up our organism. In this section, we're going to be highly focused on the endocrine system. You might encounter all of the body systems at any point in the AP exam, but the endocrine system is one of the most important because it has such a large role in cell signaling. The other ones you won't have to know about in as much specificity, but it's good to be familiar with what they do just on a surface level so that when you see them, you know what they're talking about. So one of the characteristics of life is that organisms are able to maintain homeostasis. This is the idea that an organism can maintain their own steady state or internal balance. In humans, some of the things that your body regulates for you are your body temperature, your blood pH, your blood glucose concentration, etc. And we can kind of compare this homeostatic regulation to regulation of a room temperature by a thermostat, like the kind we have in our classrooms. There are two different types of animals that exist on planet Earth. One is called a regulator or endotherms. Endo meaning inside. So these are animals that are able to use internal controls to adjust and control the internal change in their temperature despite the outside environment. You may have also heard these animals referred to as warm-blooded creatures like the walrus or you or me. We can keep ourselves warm even if we're in a very icy cold environment. A second type of animal you might have heard about is called a conformer. These are animals that allow their internal condition to change in accordance with external changes. So like lizards, reptiles, these are called ectotherms or cold-blooded animals because their body temperature is determined from the outside environment. Continuing on with this section, we're now going to discuss about how organisms maintain homeostasis using the analogy of a thermostat. So organisms all have a set point. This is a particular value that they need to maintain stability at. For example, in a room, it may be room temperature, 20 degrees Celsius. There's always a sensor present that detects when there's changes either above or below the set point. For us, a lot of our sensors are found in the different organs that are part of the endocrine system, the different glands. In a room, it's probably the thermostat itself has a temperature sensor. The stimulus is what is the action that causes the changes and stimulates the response. So it senses the changes and then stimulates a response. So for example, in a thermostat, the stimulus might be that the room temperature has increased, and then the body will respond to that stimulus. Or in the case of the thermostat, when the room temperature increases, it gets warmer, the heating is going to stop. That will eventually cause the room temperature to decrease and bring us back to our set point. Opposite stimulus could occur in which the temperature decreases. That would cause the heating to start up, the room temperature to increase, and then we're back at the set point once again. So when we talk about feedback in organisms, you might have noticed that it kind of follows a loop that depends on other parts of the process. There are two feedback loops that are commonly used to explain how homeostasis occurs. The first is negative feedback, and this is the most common feedback loop. Negative feedback occurs when the control mechanism that's produced reduces the stimulus or counters it in some way. So, for example, when you have low blood sugar, a stimulus to your body, that causes your body to increase the blood sugar via the glucagon hormone. So, glucagon helps break down the glycogen stores in the liver and release glucose into the bloodstream. That in turn increases your blood sugar and counteracts the stimulus. The opposite, which is less common form of feedback loop, is called positive feedback. This one is less common, but essentially whatever is produced increases or enhances the stimulus. And we'll talk about this one in a moment as well. One example of negative feedback is thermoregulation. So our body has an internal body temperature of approximately 36 to 38 degrees Celsius. When you have the stimulus, your increased body temperature, that sends a message to the sensor in your hypothalamus. It's like this, there's a sensor there that senses what your body temperature is. If it gets too high, the hypothalamus is going to send some hormones out to help dilate your blood vessels and also produce sweat. Now, as you can imagine, this sweat helps decrease your body temperature. But if we were to continue sweating after our body temperature decreased, we get too cold. So the production of sweat actually causes us to stop the feedback loop and come back once we get back to our internal good temperature. That's an example of negative feedback. The stimulus produces sweat, and the production of sweat signals the process to stop. Similarly, when we have a decreased body temperature, it gets colder, and our thermostat senses that, our blood vessels are going to constrict, and we're going to start shivering. But when you shiver, that increases your body temperature, and that causes the other negative feedback loop when it gets cold to stop. Another example of negative feedback is blood sugar regulation. So we have a specific level of normal glucose in the blood, and when that level gets too low, for example, you have low blood sugar, that gets detected by the glucagon releasing cells of the pancreas. Those glucagon releasing cells are stimulated to release glucagon into the blood, and their target is the liver. Because once they arrive at the liver, they can break down the glycogen stores and release glucose into the blood, and then the blood glucose levels rise. That increase in blood glucose is another stimulus that causes the glucagon to slow down release, and the body returns back to homeostasis. So the production of glucose causes this feedback loop to stop, negative feedback. When blood glucose levels rise, the opposite happens, and we get a detection once again from the pancreas that we have high blood sugar and we need to release insulin. Insulin secreting cells release insulin into the bloodstream, and that allows the liver to take up glucose as glycogen and also body cells to take up glucose. We're taking glucose out of the blood here. So that causes the blood glucose levels to decline, and once they decline enough to reach our set point, the stimulus for insulin release diminishes and the body goes back to homeostasis. So once again, once we produce the stimulus of taking up glucose from the insulin, we no longer need this process and it can stop. The most common example of positive feedback is actually breastfeeding. So with positive feedback, remember, the stimulus produces a response that in turn increases or enhances the stimulus. So in breastfeeding, the stimulus is the suckling of the infant on the mother's nipple. That stimulates neurons that are on the nipple and eventually travel to the hypothalamus and posterior pituitary gland, which secrete the hormone oxytocin. That hormone travels through the blood vessels and hits the target cells, which are the smooth muscle cells back in the breast, and that stimulates milk release from the breast. When the milk is released, though, because the infant knows they're going to get milk if they suck, they continue sucking the more milk that is released. Here's another picture showing you the baby suckling the breast. The sensory receptors detect that and send impulse to the hypothalamus, which releases oxytocin. Breast milk continues to be ejected from the breast, and because the baby's getting milk, it will keep suckling. So that's an example of positive feedback. The production of milk causes this procedure to happen even more. There are really two types of signaling in the body. The first is through hormones in the endocrine system. That would be number 2 here. And then the second is signaling by neurons in the nervous system. And we've talked about both of them in this unit. So the signaling by hormones, you have some type of stimulus that causes the release of hormones in the endocrine cells, and those hormones leave the cells. They're little chemical messengers that travel through the bloodstream. They are looking for the receptor proteins on those target cells and stimulate a particular response. The neuron signaling is an example of synaptic signaling, and this is when the signal is supposed to travel to a specific location. So those neurons are connected and the chemicals travel like neurotransmitters from one synapse to another, the spaces between nerves, until they reach their specific cell, target cell, and cause they cause the required or desired response. So the endocrine system is the main body system we've been talking about and discussing in this section. This is when signaling molecules are released into the bloodstream by endocrine cells, and this allows cell communication to happen anywhere in the body. So this is the long-distance cellular communication we've been talking about. These hormones can be universal, or they could serve only one type of target cell. There's hormones that do both. You do not need to know the major endocrine glands and their hormones for the AP exam, but they will show up. So you might find it useful to just take a look over these terms so that way when you see them, you know a little bit about what they're talking about and you're not totally blindsided. You don't have to memorize any of the functions of these hormones or these glands, but you will see them on the exam, and they will tell you what these hormones do and how they are affected. But you will have to answer questions about them, so it might be useful to just get yourself a little familiar with the terminology so that you don't trip over it on the exam. So for example, the hypothalamus is one organ that's part of the endocrine system, and it releases a lot of different hormones. All of those in red are the different hormones released by the hypothalamus. GH, which is growth hormone, MSH, prolactin, ACTH, TSH, FSH, which is follicle stimulating hormone. And then those green are the target cells or the target organs that have cells with receptors for those hormones. And so it travels all the way from the hypothalamus through the bloodstream to get to those particular organs. And we already talked about this a little bit, but there are 2 ways hormones can initiate a cellular response. So there might be cell surface receptors, where there is a receptor on the surface of the cell with a specific location for the hormone. Or there could be intracellular receptors where the hormone could pass through the lipid bilayer by itself because it's nonpolar, or might use the use of a transport protein. And then there might be a receptor inside of the cell that it's going to find and then cause its response.